Hi, welcome to another episode of Would I Buy This Again? In today's episode I will be talking about the Olympus 100 to 400mm telephoto zoom lens. So let's go. The Olympus 100 to 400mm is a telephoto zoom lens for the Micro Four Thirds format. It has an equivalent zoom range of 200 to 800mm on a full frame sensor. It weighs just over a kilo, 1120 grams to be precise. It is not a pro lens, but it does have the IPX1 rated weatherproofing. And the lens also has image stabilization in the lens. So why did I buy this lens? Well, I would consider myself sort of an all-round nature photographer. I like to photograph landscapes, but also details in that landscape and also the animals I run into when I'm out in nature. So I want to have a telephoto lens in my bag alongside more wider angle lenses and also macro lenses, for example. And for a long time I used to bring along the 75 to 300mm from Olympus, and before that the 100 to 300 from Panasonic. Both lenses that are very compact and that I really liked using. But at some point I felt I wanted to have an upgrade, maybe a bit more reach, maybe a bit better image quality than I could get out of the 75 to 300. So that's why I chose the 100 to 400. I also considered the 300mm f4 Pro lens from Olympus. Besides being a lot more expensive, I also felt it might be a bit limited in use for me because I'm not a dedicated wildlife photographer, and a fixed focal length, is just more specific. So that's why I chose this one. So before I continue, let's look at some photographs I took with this lens. And I should mention, I'm not a professional wildlife photographer. I enjoy using this lens when I'm out. And this is some of my results. So what do I like about this lens? Well, first off, its reach. It gives you the equivalent of up to 800mm on a full frame camera. The 75 to 300 already gave me quite some serious focal range. This is even a third better than that one. So that's really great. I really love that about this lens. Next to the reach, I also really enjoy the build quality of this lens. It feels very solid. It feels very much like a pro lens, even though it isn't. I would only say about the build quality that the screws around, mostly around, I don't know if you can see it, around the edge here, sometimes get loose or perhaps are not properly tightened in the factory. I'm not really sure. I've had the issue myself that I lost the screw even on this lens. So that's sort of a downside on the build quality, but otherwise really good, very happy with it. Next to the build quality, I really like the weather sealing in this lens. Again, this is not a pro lens, but it does have the weather sealing like the pro lenses do. So that's really great about it. I like just going out, and regardless of the weather, it's really nice to know that the lens can handle that. What I also really like about this lens is all the switches on the lens. You have, and I'll try to show you, there's the image stabilization switch, the autofocus manual focus switch, there's a focus range switch, and on the other side there's a lock switch which helps prevent the lens from extending, like if it's hanging like that on your camera. So if you put that lock on, it can't do that, so it stays in place. So that's really nice. I really like all of those options. Very handy when you're just out and you have your left hand on the lens and you can just control all of that. So what I also really like is the tripod mount ring. It's usually turned upwards, so I can have my hand under the lens because I don't really use it that much. But when you do use it, you can easily turn it around. It has these nice points on it, so you can properly align it. And You can just place it on a tripod like that, and it's very sturdy. I really like that on this lens. So what I also really like, last thing, is the image quality when you have good conditions. And it's important to add that. I would say it's more or less similar to the 75-300 in terms of image quality. You also can get great results with that lens when conditions are good. I'll come to the rest of that in a bit when I'm discussing the things that I don't really like about this lens. If the conditions are good, you can get good images. Then on to the things I don't like. First of all, I would have to mention the size and weight of this lens. Now I know that compared to a full frame lens, it's nonsense because it's compact and it's lightweight compared to the same range on a full frame camera. But I only use micro four thirds cameras and lenses, so that's the only thing I can really compare to for myself. So coming from the 75-300 mm, this lens is a lot bigger and certainly also a lot heavier. So whereas I would just carry the 75-300 in my bag, regardless of what I was going to photograph, it's not so much the case with this lens because you really notice it, it's in the bag. So I'm more considerate if I'm going to use it or not. And that's a bit of a downside for me. What I also don't really like about this lens has to do with the same issues. It doesn't really go so well on smaller bodies. I will only use this on my EM1 Mark III. Perhaps it could go on the EM5 Mark III as well, but I feel a little bit less comfortable doing that. Also because I've read in the past about tear out on the EM5 Mark III body, which is more plasticky. I haven't experienced anything like it myself, I should add. But still, I really think this is a lens to use with bigger bodies, and I would certainly not use it on any of my pen bodies, for example. So that's a bit limiting, and that's all things I could do with the 75-300 I had before. So a bit of a downside for this lens. Finally, the performance under less than ideal circumstances. I would say, like I just mentioned, that this lens performs quality-wise quite similar to the 75-300. When you have great light, when your subject is in a sort of an ideal range, then you can get pretty good images, very sharp, nice separation between your subject and the background. But when circumstances are less than ideal, the light is not as great, the subject is a little bit closer to the background, I would say the images are just of less quality than, for example, what you'd get out of the 300mm f4. I've used that lens in the past. I've never owned it though. But I mean, there's definitely a serious difference. It might have to do with the f numbers. It might be the quality of the glass. I'm not really sure. But it's important to note that this just isn't up to the pro standards like you would expect from some lenses. It's not a pro lens, of course, but yeah, less than ideal circumstances also renders less than ideal results. So that's something I'm not really fond of with this lens. So on to the conclusion then. Would I buy this lens again? Well, as you probably sort of got from my story, this is not an ideal lens. For me, it has a lot more weight than the 75-300. And I think you don't get the same difference in image quality like the weight difference might suggest. Because of it, I don't always carry it around as easily as the 75-300, for example. And also the images that come out aren't always what I hoped when the conditions are not so great. But on the other hand, it does give me far more reach and control than the 75-300, or like, for example, the 100-300 from Panasonic would. It does feel more like a pro lens in terms of build quality, the controls that are on the lens, and also the weather sealing, which is very important. It's also much cheaper than, for example, the 300mm f4 Pro, and certainly so than the 150-400mm from Olympus. It's more versatile than, for example, the 300mm, which is a very specific lens. And this having a 100-400mm zoom, yeah, just gives you far more options. And for someone who does a little bit of everything, like myself, that makes this lens far more usable. So in conclusion, yes, I would buy it again. And I have, in fact. It's a bit silly, but when I owned the 75-300 at some point a few years ago, I decided to sell that lens and to buy this one instead. And after some time, I regretted it, because my expectations of this lens were so high and it didn't really live up to it. So I decided to sell this lens and to buy a second-hand 75-300 again, because of all the things I just mentioned, because it's just easier to drop in your bag wherever you go. And then I think maybe 6 months later, I regretted doing that, because I missed the reach, I missed sort of the profile this lens has. So I decided to once more sell the 75-300 mil and buy another second-hand version of this lens, which is what I did late 2022. And we are a little bit over a half year further now, and yeah, I can say that I don't regret doing that. I am still quite happy with this lens. I think I'm just a bit more realistically what I can expect from this lens now. And given sort of the price difference between this lens and the more expensive Pro range, and also the versatility of it, I think this for now really is the best lens for me in the telephoto zoom range. So yes, I would buy it again. I'm very curious what you think of this lens as well. Do you own it? Are you considering it? What are your expectations? Do share them in the comments below. And finally, if you haven't yet, please subscribe so I can let you know when I have new videos. And hope to see you next time. Bye!